This ingenious series of rugged pods uses train and space shuttle technology. But designing something that could be built on a slab of ice 10,000 miles from home was a massive challenge.
This was not a smooth ride down the river, as we say. Myself and the engineers went to Los Angeles to meet with Gehry partners as they proudly showed us their model of the building, what they intended to build. And they did a very, very long exposition. And they finished by saying, well, what do you think? And the structural engineer next to me thought for a second and then said, I think you used a lot of glue to make your model stand together.
Gehry's glue-happy model makers had good reason not to confront the question of how to build it. The design's sheer originality meant there was no structural template to follow, nothing to suggest it was actually possible. But Cowie's team took a logical approach to planning the build.
It's a very tricky and complex building, geometrically, obviously, when you see it from the outside. You could break it down to 4 basic systems that put the building together.
The engineers devised a solution that was based on illusion. The huge glass sails appear to be supported by the small curving structures known as the icebergs. A signature of Frank Gehry designs, they look like the core of the building, but they're not. Melt away the icebergs and some very conventional concrete cubes emerge, within which are the gallery spaces themselves. Now these are not very Gehry, but they are very solid and allow the building's outer skin of sails to be so extreme. The site was so remote that heavy machines couldn't be used to build it. All the work had to be done by hand.
It carries 1,380 passengers an hour, and all in the middle of an earthquake zone.
But laser systems and escape tunnels keep the tourists safe from the seismic danger.
And if you don't want to take the elevator, you can just go ahead and take the 999 stone steps.
Stepping all over the park is exactly what thousands of people used to do. In the 1990s, word about the stunning landscape spread, and soon huge numbers of curious tourists were tramping through the delicate forests and climbing its fragile rocks. Its ecosystem was suffering. The Chinese government had to act. One of the best views of the park is from this peak. So to keep visitors under control, but still let them see the incredible natural wonder, they built this astonishing elevator, half inside, half outside a huge rock face. The visible 550 feet is actually only just over half the elevator's total height. The lower 500 feet is hidden in shafts tunneled inside the cliff. And at the bottom of those is a 650-foot access tunnel leading to the main concourse. It all works smoothly now, but its creation was an epic feat of human endeavor and engineering. 5,000 miles from New York, in the ancient city of Athens, Greece, engineers and architects have been battling Mother Nature to create an enormous 100,000 square foot floating roof.
To my knowledge, it's the first application in the world.
Over €500 million created a cultural center for all Athenians, complete with a new hill with a public park on top.
This isn't just about creating a building. You're creating geography.
And all of which has to be tough enough to withstand any potentially devastating earthquakes.
Building in an earthquake zone is a dangerous game.
So how did they build it? In 2006, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, a wealthy philanthropic organization, wanted to give a new home to Greece's National Opera and National Library. They wanted somewhere that would inspire the people of Athens. Eliandropoulou helped manage the €566 million grant given to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Center.
Pushing the boundaries of architecture and engineering wasn't a goal in itself, but it was a very important means to achieve the vision of the SNFCC. So we didn't want to just provide new premises to these two national organizations. We wanted to give them a new home, which would become a landmark. There were a lot of risks taken. The people involved in the project were very passionate about pushing these boundaries, and they certainly had the expertise to do so.
The foundation turned to the company that had transformed the London skyline with the Shard, the Renzo Piano Building Workshop. Giorgio Bianchi oversaw the project.
We had in mind this idea to raise the land in some way and hide the opera and the library under something like a hill. The hill was the park. I create my hill, and on top, I put the solar canopy. And then I plant my park. And here you have the opera house and the library. Easy.
Building it would prove to be anything but. The futuristic buildings would hide behind a massive 100-foot-high artificial hill. At one end, the new earthquake-proof complex would be home to the Greek National Library and the 300,000-square-foot National Opera building. It would be topped off with a huge square floating canopy over 300 feet long that would protect the complex from the fierce Greek sun and generate electricity to run it from 5,700 solar panels. Many of the building techniques needed had never been used in Greece before.
There were certainly many challenges during construction because we were pushing these boundaries in engineering. The canopy was certainly a very challenging element. The hill in the park, the seismic isolation of such a large building, all these challenges were overcome and led to great innovation.
As the extraordinary skyscrapers took shape on the Manhattan skyline, they didn't go unnoticed.
This tower, the East Tower, goes about 8.5 inches per floor. So by the time we are really offset maximum distance, we're over 20 feet, 22 feet, I think it is, out of plumb before we start working our way back. And that's the sort of visual thing that people really weren't accustomed to seeing.
The bent shape of the skyscrapers caused panic as the buildings were going up, which is something that the main builder had to deal with.
One day, we're down there, we're all working, and you hear the fire department, they pull up, and the guys come screaming, and they're running in, and it's a little chaos for a second, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. And finally, I grab the guy, I go, what's going on? What's happening? I'm in charge here, what's going on? He said, we got a call. One of the buildings is falling down. And I kind of stopped and I had to think about it for a second. I go, no, it's supposed to be like that. Showed him pictures and renderings of the building and showed him the plans and everything, but it's such a unique architectural feature that people didn't know how to respond to it.
Copies of famous landmarks might get you noticed on Vegas's main strip, but how do you make a big impression if your building plot is on the outskirts of town?
To get noticed in Vegas, they had to build something impossible.
But this was no casino. Here a man was inspired to build a hospital so extraordinary it could also be a fundraising event space.
I said to my wife, Camille, if we're gonna do this, we gotta make a statement.
The result was a building almost as complex as the organ that inspired it.
There are two halves of this building. Just like the human brain, the left side is ordered and logical, and the right side is wild and creative.
This is the Lou Ruvo Center for Brain Health. Designed in California, engineered in Europe, fabricated in Asia, and built on 2 acres of Nevada desert. It's the show-stopping outcome of 65,000 hours of engineering effort, $80 million, and nearly 900 tons of steel. It doesn't look possible. So, how did they build it? The building is the brainchild of American entrepreneur Larry Ruvo, driven to create it after experiencing the moment his father Lou was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease.
I just said I would never want anybody to go through this humiliating, lack of dignity experience that I just went through. If I could ever do anything, I would change that.
Larry decided to build a new hospital for degenerative brain disorders. As well as being ideal for treatment and research, he also wanted it to be so visually extraordinary that people would want to hire it for events. To design it, Larry turned to one of the world's greatest architects, Frank Gehry. Aged 81 at the time, Gehry was very much at the top of his game, as one of his projects, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, had recently proved. Winds of over 60 miles per hour have been known to hit Singapore, so extra strength was needed to protect the fragile grid shell domes of the gardens by the bay. The answer was to crane in 28 radiating steel arches, which would stretch over the roofs. These arches were then bolted together, connected at their bases to a concrete ring beam, which itself was anchored to the deep piles driven down through the reclaimed land. Then, they were bolted to the latticework frame. The domes could now absorb any high wind pressures and avoid a catastrophic structural failure. Now it was ready for the glass.
In the conservatories, we have the arched ribs, which provide the resistance to forces which are sideways, which shells are not particularly good at resisting. So there we've got two things combined, the shell stiffness, the shape, and the arched ribs, which are very stiff horizontally.
The success of the 2 grid shells is clear, with over 100,000 healthy plants thriving inside. The team constructed 7 temporary metal piers. On top of all of the piers, computer-controlled hydraulic platforms would lift and move each road deck along very slowly out towards the center, with the middle road decks already rigged with 2 pylons. Launched from both sides, the road decks moved just 23 inches every 4 minutes, 5 times slower than a snail, until they met in the middle.
Each piece would move forward inches at a time. It took days to get the whole thing into place.
With each deck taking up to 3 days to reach its final position, this process was vulnerable to one of the region's most unpredictable threats. Winds in the Tarn Valley had been recorded at 125 miles per hour, but even much lighter winds would cause problems during the critical deck launches.
Every morning, the site receives the weather prediction, and we decide not to launch if we have not 5 days in front of us with less than these 37 kilometers per hour.
Can you imagine what would happen if a giant piece of this road deck got caught up by the wind? And it would cause really bad damage.
Working around the clock for 2 days, the central sections of the Millau viaduct, complete with the 2 middle pylons, were finally within touching distance. Global positioning systems had been used to plot their path. Despite starting at different heights and with a gentle curve throughout the 1.5 miles, when the roads met, they were within the 1 centimeter tolerance. The final component was not entirely crucial to the engineering, but was a fitting way to celebrate an incredible piece of innovation. This deserted quarry, a 30-minute drive from Shanghai, was earmarked to become the exact opposite of a tourist destination.
The government planned to make this place as a treatment place for the garbage.
But a developer had a vision: to create a hotel with a feature so unique that people would travel from around the world to experience it. Tasked with turning this site from garbage can to gold mine was architect Martin Jochman.
When I first the quarry, actually it was completely overgrown and the water level was quite high. It was more like a lake, which was surrounded by old industrial buildings and overgrown vegetation.
Martin used the location's natural assets as a starting point for his design.
The inspiration for the design came from the quarry and from the greenery, from the rocks, from the waterfalls. And it needed to span between the ground level and the bottom of the quarry itself. This was what would make it really outstanding and spectacular.
Martin was keen to create a building that fitted naturally and seamlessly into the environment. What appears to be just a two-story, grass-covered complex at ground level is only the tip of the structural iceberg. Hidden below is the main 16-story hotel room section of the building, the design embracing shapes from within the quarry. One half curves in, the other out. Between them is a waterfall-like glass atrium, which houses the elevator shafts and services. But it's at water level where things are most unusual. Here, huge 16-foot deep aquariums hold over 300 tons of water, so the lowest two floors of restaurants and guest suites have huge windows onto an extraordinary underwater world.
What I tried to do is to create a building mass that joined with the quarry and became part of it. It became part of the overall character of the quarry itself.
To make sure the skyscraper could survive even New York's strongest winds, the engineers had another trick up their sleeves. The masterstroke, the brilliant engineering trick, is hidden away at the very top of the tower on the 84th floor. Two secret giant machines that directly counteract the wind.
The wind acting on the building wants to make it sway. To stop that happening, then they've used tuned mass dampers, which means a huge lump of concrete high up in the building. It's an active system, which means that when the building wants to sway in one direction, the hydraulic jacks will move that lump of concrete in the other direction, counteracting that force and hopefully keeping the building not moving too much.
This particular building, we have a damper, weighs about 1,300 tons, absorbing the energy of the wind that exerts on the building. So it has to be fast enough so the occupant that sits in the apartment doesn't feel that the movement of the building.
Which is good news if you've paid over $75 million for one of the incredible apartments.
432 is without a doubt a feat of world-class engineering. It cost a staggering $1.25 billion to build, and by my estimation, it's about as beautiful as a skyscraper can get.
Historically, we'd build buildings with the walls carrying the weight. Stone huts back in the Dark Ages. The walls carried the roof, and that was how you protected you from the wind and the rain. So we took the option of using the shell of the building as its structure, kind of going back to the old way of doing things, make the outside of the building hold the building up, and then you don't need to put anything inside. Because of the way the building is pulling on all the different bits of itself, the roof pulls on the walls pull on the roof, we had to design it as one big object.
To make the most of the exhibition spaces, the architect didn't want any interior columns. To achieve this, the shell of the building, the exterior walls, had to support the roof and themselves. No easy task given their extreme shapes. The solution was to design the shell to work as one piece, using its own weight and steel reinforcements to hold the building together. But there was a problem. The shell would be only structurally sound when the last piece was in place. Until then, the whole building was unstable.
So the leaning walls and the whole building is really held together by these tension forces pulling everything back towards that central core.
The skin of the building itself is doing all the work. It's carrying the weight of the building, it's pushing and pulling with different forces, it's resisting the wind and the rain, it's keeping the building watertight, holding the facade up and the cladding on the outside, but it's primarily supporting the building.
Following German bombing in World War II, Rotterdam's flattened city center had been redeveloped, but somehow it had lost its soul.
Rotterdam was planned after the war in a very functional way where they separated living and working and shopping.
And business-like.
Exactly, so they realized, hey, maybe we should combine it because it's not that great to separate.
To liven things up, the city challenged architects to design a permanent covered market with hundreds of new homes on either side.
So the program demands for 2 slabs of housing and somewhere in between a market hall. I said to them, yeah, but that's boring. So instead of having this with the 2 slabs and then a market hall in between, I said, why don't we turn it upside down so that you have slabs on either side and you have more penthouses here and you have a big hall, like a space where you can breathe and where you can monumentalize and good food.
The final approved design was an ingenious merging of housing and markets where not a square inch of space was wasted. It would all be built on massive 4-story deep foundations the size of 2 football fields, dug out of waterlogged ground and waterproofed with concrete. On top, 228 apartments cast in concrete would be stacked like huge bricks, creating the arch walls with the final top floor of penthouses that lock it all together and create the roof. Cladding inside the huge 111-foot-high tunnel would create the largest work of art in the world. Finally, at each end, a grid of cables that would support hundreds of panes of glass, protecting the market stalls and cafes inside from the weather.
They've made an entire building in this arched form, and they've managed to dot apartments and rooms throughout it. It's a really interesting and quite fun piece of engineering.
The city of Guangzhou is a giant metropolitan center, home to 25 million people, over 3 times the population of New York. In 2002, the regional government commissioned a new centerpiece that would hold its own amongst the city's gleaming skyscrapers. A $200 million opera house. It was designed by the late Zaha Hadid, an architect whose visions pushed the boundaries of engineering. She found her inspiration just a stone's throw away on the banks of the Pearl River. Simon Yu was the project architect overseeing its construction.
We had this concept of these 2 pebbles by the river, so it's like placed on the river banks, and with the sort of water that sort of washes over it, or these pebbles which are dragged along the sort of the riverbank.
The inspiration may have been simple, but it meant creating one of the most advanced buildings in the world.
When you're emulating a natural shape, the first things that go out of the window are symmetry and repetition.
The complex would be made up of 2 auditoriums, a smaller 400-seater, and next door, the larger opera house, able to seat 1,800 people in its acoustically perfect hall. Both buildings would be cloaked in a net of 12,000 tons of steel-framed triangles, joined together by 59 huge, specially designed connectors, creating a strong enough frame for the building's exterior coat. Each is then covered in over 75,000 unique hand-cut granite triangles, completing the stunning vision of two pebbles on a riverbank. The jewel in Brighton's seaside crown was once the West Pier. It had been the finest Victorian pier in Britain, but throughout the 20th century, it had fallen into disrepair. And then, in 2003, it was all but destroyed by an arson attack. Brighton Council were on the hunt for a must-see attraction that reflected the original pioneering spirit of the West Pier, but with a 21st century twist. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, the architectural wizards behind the iconic London Eye, Julia Barfield and David Mark, had come up with a new and exciting visitor attraction that they thought would be the solution.
The success of the London Eye was such that we got approached by many people wanting to replicate it. And so we kind of looked at what was the essence of the London Eye, and we then looked at how we could replicate that experience in a different form.
David and Julia's design for the I-360 would see visitors rise up into the sky to get a panoramic peek at the breathtaking surroundings. It was decided the perfect spot for it would be in the shadow of the remains of the old West Pier.
It is the site of the original West Pier, which is one of the only Grade 1 listed piers in the country. It was one of the most innovative piers in its time, and sadly it burnt down. So it was like the phoenix from the flames, really.
The final design for the I-360 would be a world first, as well as the tallest structure in all of Sussex. The 531-foot tower is made up of 17 stacked steel cans that get taller and thinner as they go up. They're held together by 1,336 bolts, weighing a combined 30 tons. The 900-ton tower supports a 59-foot wide toughened glass and steel pod that's 10 times the size of a London Eye capsule and can hold up to 200 people. It uses state-of-the-art cable car technology to drive the pod up and down at less than 1 mile per hour. In a bid to increase capacity, while also creating attractive, comfortable homes, Peng and his team drew up a plan that would become the world's tallest public housing residential buildings. Packed into the awkward question mark-shaped plot would be 7 534-foot towers. Each would be joined to the next at the 26th and 50th stories by 6 enormous sky bridges. 65 feet wide, these bridges would provide 215,000 square feet of greenery and outdoor space for the residents to enjoy. And with each measuring over 1,600 feet long, they'd create the longest sky gardens in the world if engineers could figure out how to build them. Imagine the engineering it takes to build an advanced scientific research center that can cope with outside temperatures of minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit and house 60 people. It has to be completely self-sufficient for months on end and be able to move locations quickly when danger strikes.
It's a brutal environment for any building to survive in.
But that's the building the British Antarctic Survey needed. A mobile research station that could survive in the most hostile place on Earth, Antarctica. This ingenious series of rugged pods uses train and space shuttle technology so that top scientists can study our planet's atmosphere all year round. But designing something that could be built on a slab of ice 10,000 miles from home was a massive challenge.
The people who were building it had to actually use electrically heated gloves to counteract frostbite.
The crippling cold was only one of the hurdles a dedicated team had to overcome to pull this off. Every part had to be delivered to an ice dock that could crack open at any moment. Snowdrifts would bury the buildings and equipment in the blink of an eye. And the summer build season was so short, it would take 5 years to complete. The result was the extreme mobile research station called Halley 6. So, how did they build it? In 1997, work began on a new concert hall in Santa Cruz de Tenerife in the Canary Islands. Spanish modernist architect Santiago Calatrava, who'd recently finished the awesome Oculus Transport Hub in New York's Trade Center, had designed the building that could match any music venue in the world for visual drama, both inside and out. His design of flowing forms performing impossible engineering gymnastics, all clad in seamless concrete, would be one of the greatest construction challenges of its time. The most difficult to build would be the 3 curved components at the heart of the structure. Each would have a nickname. The nut would be the 147-foot-high central building to house the 2 performance auditoriums. It would also provide a single point of crucial support. The nut would be flanked by the 2 sails. The curving slabs are actually the outer walls of the main concert hall. On top is the wing. This massive structure, weighing the same as 10 747 aircraft, would be made of a steel frame clad in a thin layer of ingeniously cast concrete. It would rest on that small point of support provided by the nut.